The graph is a way to make a line graph within Vizrt. And when we drag it into the scene tree and or the scene editor, we don't see anything. Even with the bounding box on, all you get is a little icon there in the middle. So what we need to do is click on the graph to go into the properties editor here. And within the editor, the first thing that we have is the use LOD. Since we have nothing created yet, we don't need to worry about the use LOD at the moment. Below that, we have a width, which is set to 200 by default. So I'm just going to go ahead and type in 500 there, just to make sure I have enough room when I go to add my points on this graph. We also have a height, which is set to 100 by default. I'm going to go ahead and just change that to 300 just to make sure we have enough height when we go to create our graph. Now we also have a start, an end, and a line width, and we'll worry about that once we get some points into our graph. And to get some points into our graph, what we need to do is come down to these x0, y0, x1, y1, and so forth. In here, we need to begin to plot some points. So I'm going to leave my x0 at 0 and my y0 at 0. And I'm going to start to adjust my x1. And I'm going to come down and type in 20 for x1. And then y1, let's type in 10. And then we'll go down to x2 and we can type in 30. And we'll move down to y2 and we'll leave it at 0. Let's come down to one more, to x3, and we'll type in 40. Now we'll go down to y3 and type in 20. And you can see up here in our scene editor how our graph begins to grow here. So as we plot points here on the x, such as x4, we'll type in 50, since 40 was the last x point we typed in. Now with the Y4, if I just come in and move this manually, you can see how this is adjusting the graph here. So if we want to scale this graph up a little bit, we could come back into the transformation editor, scale this up, and reposition it where we need it. Back in the graph editor, if you want to keep adding points here, you can. So you have up to 50 points that you can plot across the screen within this graph editor. So now that we have our graph, we can come up and start to adjust the other settings here. And first we have this start, which is set to 0 by default. So if I increase this, you can see that it's now taking away the start point. So the start point is at 0, and if we wanted to animate this graph on, we could use this end point or start point to animate this and have the graph come on. So you can see as I adjust the end point how it's animating that graph on to the end point. We also have a line width, so we can increase the width or decrease the width of this line graph. We also have a 3D setting, so we can turn the 3D setting on this graph on. And once we do that, we have the extrusion depth, which we can adjust as well. Now, down below, we have a use vertex color, and we can use this to color the graph. And if I come in and give it a color here, you can see that it gives it a color. However, since we do have our 3D setting on with this graph and we give it a color, you can see how it doesn't pick up the shading. So if I go back into my graph and I turn this use vertex color off and I use one of my materials from our server that has shading, you can now see how this graph picks up the shading. And now you can see the extrusion depth and how deep you want to set it.